original Dark Souls is a classic, and for good reason. Its mechanics are tight, the atmosphere is moody and appropriate, and the world design is stellar. The world of the game feels tangible, which I think is down to a few key factors. The sounds of your character's footsteps dominating the soundscape during exploration, the lack of music outside of battles and key moments, the use of inverse kinematic techniques to plant your character's feet firmly on the ground, and the fact that your weapon swings bounce off the walls if swung carelessly. The attack animations feel right, with appropriate weight behind each swing. This isn't to say this is a perfect game though, far from it. The late game of Dark Souls is significantly weaker than the first half to 3/4 of it, where bosses become gimmickier, the difficulty balance crumbles, and portions feel rushed or incomplete. Namely Lost Izalith, but most of the final 4 areas suffer from these issues in some way. What was, and still is, unique about Dark Souls is its story does everything it can to not be in the way. There's the intro, a change in objective about halfway through, and then the ending. That's it in terms of explicitly told story. There's no plot twist really in a traditional sense. Everything is told through the environment, item descriptions, and from various NPCs you meet along the way. What this essentially does is reward the curious and investigative player. For example, Link in the Fire is not the only ending the game offers. You can turn your back on it and let the flames be extinguished. Very well hidden NPCs will tell you about this. Observant players may also catch on to the point that a lot of the perceived authority figures are often hiding something or not telling you the whole truth. For example, if the player kills Guinevere at the end of Anor Londo, it's revealed that the sun it bathes in is an illusion. In fact, most of it is. This leads one to conclude that the undead are being used as kindling for the first flame, that the old gods are clinging to their age of fire with pure desperation. It may cause you to question NPCs associated with the Way of White, the covenant most closely associated with the gods of Lordran, and maybe you'll notice they're not to be trusted much either. All of this to say that everything about Dark Souls feels extremely deliberate and thoroughly thought through. There's a reason so many people here on YouTube made such a name for themselves piecing together the evidence in the game to create a larger picture. It's a game that keeps giving and feels conclusive by its end. How could you possibly make a sequel to a game that explores itself so thoroughly? To find out how From Software went about this, I'll be looking at Dark Souls 2 and 3, giving an overview of what they were like as games briefly, and then discussing how they explored various themes in the narratives to expand upon the original Dark Souls. Let's start with Dark Souls 2. This game had a troubled development, changing directors partway through, while also tasked with the gargantuan task of following up one of the most beloved games of all time. In places, this certainly shows. Visually, I think it's a bit more cartoony and is certainly not as detailed in its environments or its characters compared to the original game. Dark Souls 1 characters didn't look amazing either, but there's a certain pop to them in Dark Souls 2 which wasn't there before, like they don't quite blend into the world as seamlessly. This extends to the character you play as too. The movement felt to me a bit floatier compared to the original, and for the longest time I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then I realised it's because of the walking animations. They look fine but a bit stiff. There seems to be less weight to the movement like you could see in Dark Souls 1. The animations aren't the worst part of the visuals, as there's still some good work on the show for the most part, but instead the look of the world. Dark Souls 2 is a long game with a lot of areas, but the downside to this is that a fair number of environments are very flatly textured. One of the worst offenders to me is the shaded wood, where entire structures are made of a singular green moss stone texture repeated ad nauseum. It looks awful. Dark Souls 2 infamously dropped the believably connected world. This design aspect is disappointing, but with the troubled development it's understandable, I suppose. It does mean that some places connect in an illogical way, and you travel nowhere near as far as it's alluded to. I think the idea is that in the interconnecting areas you're supposed to be disoriented enough to not realise, but unfortunately, they're short enough and nowhere near complex enough to mask it properly. Never mind the magic elevator that lifts you up from a poison fort to a castle sinking in lava. On the flip side of all this is the fact that there is undoubtedly a wide variety of locations found throughout Dark Souls 2. You never know what's going to pop up next, and that's sort of exciting in and of itself. Some of the locations are genuinely awesome looking. Despite the lack of cohesiveness between levels, the designs of the levels themselves are mostly, alright. Nothing really sticks out to me as overly bad, and I think the changes made to the enemy placements etc. are well done in the Scholar of the First Sin edition. The biggest flaw I can think of really is that a lot of the levels are built rather flatly, with not a lot of verticality, meaning that a lot of the maze-like feel of the Dark Souls 1 areas is lost. There are exceptions to this of course, particularly in the excellent DLC areas, but they're more of an exception than a rule. Most areas are made for you to fight and travel through, and that seems to be about it. Nothing is as bad as Islip from Dark Souls 1 though, although I'd argue that's the only true bad area of that game. There are certainly more bonfire checkpoints found throughout the world of Dark Souls 2 compared to Dark Souls 1 too, although I think a lot of that stems from the fact there's so many more distinct areas. I never really caught myself thinking that there were too many bonfires within a given area, but I never really found myself being overly relieved to see one either. The bosses in the game are mostly uninspired when compared to the original game. A lot of them don't have much in the way of lore implications, or if they do, they're either confusing, like the old Dragon Slayer, or just not particularly impactful overall, like the Smelter Demon. This doesn't apply to all the bosses, of course. There's a few fights in this game I think are actually really good, but for the most part they're a little underwhelming. Take the Dragonrider for example. This is an early-ish fight where the gimmick is the arena if you don't pull the levers to provide more space. It doesn't work great though, as the fight itself isn't very challenging, nor is the arena much of a detriment. Removing the only obstacle for the fight makes it trivial. In the same way, let's look at a similar boss in Dark Souls 1, the Capra Demon. On its own, the monster you fight isn't that challenging. Sure, he hits hard, but he also telegraphs his attacks very clearly. The difficulty of the fight, which makes it tough, is the arena and his dog companions. The actual challenge of the fight is dealing with the dogs and navigating the tight space you have. What's the challenge of Dragonrider? Flip the obvious switches and there isn't any anymore. This doesn't apply to all the bosses of course, at worst they're just very simple and easy, but the more challenging fights or spectacular fights are great. Fights like Mirror Knight and Velstadt come to mind. Nothing is as bad and unfinished as Bed of Chaos. So that's a quick overview of how Dark Souls 2 compares to the original as a game. What about Dark Souls 3? Development for this game was not nearly as obviously troubled and saw the return of Miyazaki as the director. Putting my opinion out there front and centre, it's in a lot of ways better than Dark Souls 2 overall, but still doesn't quite reach the heights of the original. A lot of that having to do with this being a direct sequel, and this is a problem with Dark Souls 2 as well, so a lot of the mystery and intrigue is lost. The focus of the discovery phase in the worlds of Dark Souls 2 and 3 is less, what does this world have to show me, and more becomes, how does this all link back to the previous game? This is less a failing on the game's or the player side, but more just the nature of sequels and the subconscious mindset you can have going into them. Both games deal with the fact that they're sequels in interesting ways with their narratives and themes, but I'll save that for after the overview of Dark Souls 3. Straight away I can tell you that progression through Dark Souls 3 is much more linear than in both Dark Souls 1 and 2. This isn't to say that the levels themselves are more linear, but more that your progression from area to area is a lot more restricted with less options for skips or choice of path. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. What this ensures is that this game has the best difficulty balancing of the series so far. You don't run into the issues you had previously, like the first half of Dark Souls 2 getting increasingly easier only for it to not quite recover, or the areas unlocked after beating Anolonda in Dark Souls 1 suffering a similar fate. The return of Miyazaki in the director's chair seems to have brought a tighter focus on the world construction too. Each area is more believably connected to the next this time, with you able to more easily and accurately able to pick out future areas in the distance. This was still present in Dark Souls 2 in a way, but distances were much more exaggerated and didn't reflect the actual playable space accurately. Mostly because if they did, then half the levels would be on top of each other. Instead, Dark Souls 3 is much closer to the original game in cohesiveness of the whole world you play in. What it doesn't share with Dark Souls 1 though is the direct connectivity from area to area. In Dark Souls 1, several areas had connecting points to other areas. Darkroot Garden, for example, would connect to Undead Parish, Undead Burg, with an alternate path to the area locked off behind a door requiring a key. The classic example, of course, being the elevator down from Undead Parish to find yourself back in the Firelink Shrine, closing one huge loop through several areas. Nothing quite so dramatic happens in Dark Souls 3. There are two branches out from Road of Sacrifices, and you can see a part of Farron Keep on the other side of a broken bridge at the start of the Undead Settlement, but there's certainly none of the overlap in Dark Souls 3 that characterised a lot of the original game's level design. Overall, the actual level design is pretty good, and builds upon itself more akin to the original game. Areas such as Cathedral of the Deep and Grand Archives come to mind regarding that. An issue that does crop up, however, is that there's times when there's just far too many bonfires. I think part of why this crops up is due to every boss dropping one, but surely designers could have considered that. A couple of examples. The bonfire that hosts the Grand Archives is used for a massive, complex area, but you can literally see the bonfire dropped by the previous boss, Dragon Slayer Armor, while standing next to it. Another example is the one dropped by High Lord Walner. There are two almost instantly after him, one by the bridge into Irithyll, and one just in the entrance. Now, I understand the purpose of these extra ones. The one on the bridge is there if you didn't visit the Cathedral of Deep first and so can't progress, giving you a handy walk point. The other being the start of Irithyll. I think the crux of my problem is the fact that bosses drop them too. There's no need for it. This wasn't something done in the previous games except when there was no way back from the arena. This does happen in Bloodborne though, so this may have been a holdover from using the same version of the engine. Dark Souls 3 has a quirk which sets it apart from the other games in the series. The combat is significantly faster. Enemies flail, attacks are quicker, and fast rolling is much easier to attain, making it feel closer to Bloodborne in its combat pacing. Even some of the enemy designs look a bit like they were rejected from Bloodborne. The faster combat has led to the armor balance being a bit out of whack though. The higher fast rolling threshold means the game expects you to stack as much heavy armor as you can. This wasn't a problem before, as light armor was the only way to roll quickly, and with this game ditching the mid roll from Dark Souls 1 and the progressively slower rolls of Dark Souls 2, it's all but encouraged. The bosses of Dark Souls 3 are an improvement on Dark Souls 2, this aspect of the game showing off From's development as a studio extremely well. There are fewer overall bosses here compared to either of the previous games, however there is some fights here which easily rank amongst the best of the series. Abyssal Watchers are the first Lord of Cinder boss you come across, and it sets a bar for the other Lord fights which they don't quite match. The music and aesthetics of the battle are stellar. Same can be said for a late game boss for me, Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Extremely good visuals of the way she moves and the way the room starts catching on fire as the fight goes on. I have similar praise for the final two fights as well, Prince Lothric and Soul of Cinder. Prince Lothric's fight is hectic, challenging, but far from unsurmountable, with a phase transition cutscene I really like. Soul of Cinder is the best final boss of the three games. It's a big challenge, has a huge variety of moves, and it's just an overall solid capstone to the main progression of the game. There's still some clunkers though. Osiris has really janky hitboxes for his charge moves, which have very little in the way of telegraphs. High Lord Wolnir and Curse-Rotted Greatwood are just annoying gimmick bosses. Crystal Sage is just bad and almost pointless. And I'm kind of in two minds about Pontiff Suleiman. For the Pontiff, it makes sense he's a big challenging boss as he's very important to the lore of the game. But his fight is so incredibly frustrating in places. He has attacks that combo for a ridiculous amount of time. He can end his combos unpredictably. He can recover from his attacks almost unfairly quick. Some of his moves overlap in a way that makes them almost impossible to dodge properly. All I'm saying is that I think his placement in the game maybe provides just a smidge too much of a difficulty spike. Especially when Aldrich not long after him is a total pushover in comparison. That's the overview of Dark Souls 2 and 3 done then. I didn't go over every detail, I know, such as barely touching on healing mechanics, basic combat and covenants, etc. But I felt that would just bog down the discussion I wanted to have. Those aspects, to me, are not quite as important as the ones I decided to highlight. Now, one thing I purposely left out of discussion of any of the games so far is the narratives and themes. That's because I wanted to discuss them separately and focus on them on their own. This is also where things get a lot more speculative, which is something that the game story is encouraged due to the intentionally not explaining everything clearly. So, let's get stuck into some narrative themes I think crop up, and how I think the sequels expand and explore different aspects of what the original game brought to the table. Let's start with Dark Souls 1. The story of this game is pretty simple really, it's mostly a creation myth and it's starting to come to its end. In the intro we're introduced to the world changing from a grey, cold, almost lifeless origin, and then with the discovery of fire bringing a dichotomy to the world, or as they call it, disparity. Primarily, this fire brings a light and dark into the world, further supported by Gwyn's Age of Prosperity being referred to as the Age of Fire. But of course, just like real fires, the flame will eventually fade, and the world will only be left with the dark. The use of fire as the stand-in for light is interesting. Fire is fleeting, as already mentioned, and it expires without more fuel added to it. It is also often used when referring to certain sayings, like a moth drawn to a flame. A moth can be seen as a creature of the dark being attracted by the light, much like how the humans of Dark Souls are literally made of the Dark Soul. So, in a way, this is a subtle way that the game hints at the true nature of linking the fire, which is the ending most players will be pushed towards on their first playthrough. The gods of the world of Dark Souls are clinging to the past, holding as tightly as they can to their heyday to the point where they've devised plans to manipulate the humans into extending their age of fire for them. They weaponize the draw of the light, going so far as to create illusions of Anor Londo to fabricate the amount of light left in the world, and to turn the power of the undead against former allies in order to link the fire and prolong the inevitable. Despite Dark Souls being a rather unforgiving game for a few people, One of its defining themes for its mechanics and some of its subplots is hope and camaraderie. This contrasts the decaying nature of the world you find yourself in, but shows itself through the online functionality. I didn't play in online mode for these playthroughs, but the online message system and the bloodstain mechanics assure you that you're not alone in this world. The messages help you, or in some cases provide levity through the unique humour people developed using the system. The bloodstains assure you that even if you're struggling, there are others who are too, and from each other maybe you can learn to overcome the obstacles. Character stories in the world itself, like Siegmeyer and Solaire, also provide the player with camaraderie and hope, with the latter being available to help fight a large portion of the mandatory bosses in the game. The subplots end rather tragically, of course, but it doesn't take away from what they provided you throughout the game. What all this means for the overall themes and narratives of the game is that true hope and companionship comes from your peers, and not the gods that rule, or ruled, the world. The characters, the messages, the bloodstains, all of those are from fellow undead, fellow beings of dark. The hope that's provided by the gods, the bells of awakening that push the undead to link the first flame, that's false hope. Hope that is turned against those that seek it to attain their own self-serving needs. Even the whole prophecy of the chosen undead seems to ring hollow upon reflection. It's a fable, a manipulative story spread to attempt to get a powerful undead to self-select themselves to be a tool of the old gods. While on the topic of game mechanics being used as metaphors, let's discuss the hollowing effect in the world of Dark Souls. When an undead loses all their purpose, loses their souls, they become a hollow. These are essentially empty vessels that run on base instinct alone. This has been interpreted in several ways by many others. The only characters that can go hollow are humans, and a way that you can look at this is that this represents someone quitting the game. A player character never truly goes hollow, but you can interpret the act of quitting the game and never coming back as what would essentially be hollowing for that player character, abandoned and left to wander the world with no purpose. This is mostly supported by the way hollowing affects various NPCs in the world. When a human NPC goes hollow, this usually occurs after their purpose in the world becomes obsolete or they choose to give up on it. Examples include the crestfallen warrior, who leaves the Firelink Shrine after the appearance of Frampt, who emits a terrible stench. He leaves, but having abandoned the only thing keeping him from going hollow, essentially guiding new arrivals to the shrine in his own melancholic way, he very quickly loses his mind. He's found just below the shrine, in the ruins of New Londo, attacking anyone who wanders down there. Other examples include vendor NPCs like Griggs of Vinheim, who move away from Firelink Shrine once you've purchased all their items and go hollow there due to their purpose in life being fulfilled. Another take I've seen on the themes of Dark Souls is that it represents defeating depression, or at least tackling it. The idea is that you tackle the challenges of the game head on, struggling along the way with every defeat threatening to be your last, taunting you to enter that forever hollow state of giving up on trying to advance, dig your heels in, and shut off from the world. A lot of people who play the game for the first time will die a lot. That's pretty much a universal experience if they've never played any of these games before. The marketing and the decaying nature of the world reinforce the idea that this place isn't welcoming, that the place you find yourself in wants you to fail. But as you grow more familiar with the game, with death being rendered meaningless from its frequency, perhaps you'll start to notice the beauty lying beneath the surface. Perhaps a particular landscape catches your eye, or you resonate with the story of another character within the world. These remind you that no matter how bad it may seem right now, there's still something worth persevering for, worth fighting for. And so, you push back, with the knowledge from all your previous failures backing you up, and finally finish the game. The fact it's challenging, that it isn't easy, is the bulk of what makes this reading hold weight. Nothing worth fighting for is won easily. Finishing the game can feel like an achievement. It's a feeling that's hard to replicate and brings us back to the themes I brought up earlier, of the dichotomy of light and dark, life and death. Dark Souls ultimately falls on the side of life. It's a celebration of life in a way. The player character embraces death and the lessons it can teach us, and uses that to achieve something with their lives. As you may be able to tell, I think Dark Souls is a rather special and important game. It's obviously inspired many other games with its mechanics and atmosphere. However, I think most of the games it's inspired fail to focus on what truly made it so special. I've barely touched on the different ways you can interpret the world of this game, and that's what I mean. The world and lore of Dark Souls is built different compared to most others, with plenty of room for metaphorical interpretation of its story and lore, as well as providing compelling straight readings too. Again, just look at some of the most viewed videos on this game. They're mostly discussing the lore. This metaphorical reading potential is what makes me feel it's such a complete game though. It feels impossible to run out of ways to think about it, and that's why it feels so standalone. It doesn't need a sequel, and yet, Bandai Namco thought otherwise, and so, Dark Souls 2 was brought to the world. Dark Souls 2 has a plot and themes that bounce off the original in a way that steers it in almost a completely different direction. Appropriately for this version of the game I played, Dark Souls 2 takes a more scholarly approach. The story starts extremely different from Dark Souls 1. We're not treated to a cinematic that tells us of the big important figures that shaped the world. Instead we're given a metaphorical interpretation of someone being cursed with being undead. Their loved ones disappear like melting wax, representing the fading memory of them, and are told of a land where they can seek a way to break the curse, Dragonrider. The nature of the curse and the want to find a way to break it is a much more explicit plot point in Dark Souls 2 compared to the original game. It was always present, of course, but with the way the world was, it was pretty much accepted as a given and not a whole lot of attention was given to the curse itself. You could have entered the world of Lordran asking the same sort of questions that Dark Souls 2 makes much more explicit in its opening. What is the curse, and is there a way to cure it? These questions aren't fully answered in Dark Souls 2 as, just like in the original game, others are willing to steer the player character into a different path. It doesn't take long after stepping into Dragonrider that you start hearing mentions of kings and monarchies, the Emerald Herald asking if you could be the next monarch, or if you're just another pawn of fate. The overall narrative in Dark Souls 2 mostly centers around a few select important characters. Vendrick, the king of Dragonrider, his brother Aldia, and Nashandra, the queen of Dragonrider. Vendrick is described as the king of the land by a few NPCs, with Nishandra saying that he never took the true throne, something people, often the Emerald Herald, think you could do. What does it mean to take the true throne anyway in the world of Dark Souls 2? Well, it seems to be attaining the power to be able to link the first flame, with the culmination of that power manifesting itself as a great soul within you, and sitting upon a throne of want to do so. The ending seems to imply that the throne of want, situated beneath Dragonrider Castle, is a small kiln designed to burn the fuel for the first flame. Evidence for this mostly comes in the form of the room with the throne being full of ash. The dialogue here seems to indicate that this isn't an automatic process though. This being a sealed area, the monarch can use their power to link the flame, or stay seated and wait for it to fade, echoing the two endings of the original game, with the final choice the player character makes left intentionally ambiguous. Why does Nishandra want to stop you? Well, she's a fragment of the Abyss, a splintered shard of the soul of Manus from the first game, who over time has taken form, and is a manifestation of part of her father's personality. Nashandra is the shard that seeks power, and her appearance is not unlike Dusk from the original game too, who Manus had a fondness for. She attempts to stop the player character at the end of the game, as that's when their power is at its greatest. So if she can stop you and take that power for herself, then she'll become the most powerful being in the world. Therefore, she talks of Vendrick in a very disappointed manner. He never quite achieved the goal she hoped he'd achieve, so she never had the chance to try and take it from him. Vendrick is a very interesting character though, and is part of what I meant earlier when saying this game takes a more scholarly approach to exploring its story elements. The deal with Vendrick is that he filled the role of a player character in the past. He killed 4 Great Ones and attained enough power to link the fire, fulfilling his destiny. He rejects this though. The undead curse plagued him and his people, and through research conducted by himself and his brother Aldia, eventually learned that this cycle of fire and the curse are interwoven. He learned that to fulfill the destiny laid out for him would just lead to the inevitable, that all of this would play out again. His kingdom would fall and be forgotten like all the others encountered throughout the game, with only husks of the former glory remaining. Vendrick rejected this idea, and instead sought a way to break the curse for good. He abandoned the castle and his kingdom, hid himself when Nashandra couldn't find him, and peered into the essence of the soul, while his brother took a darker route with his research. Aldia researched dragons and the link to immortality, but also conducted horrific experiments upon the giants to further his attempts at creating a dragon. It turns out that Aldia was partially successful in his attempts at immortality, although it came at a massive price it seems. He appears within the bonfires and appears to talk to the player character on several occasions. He mentions the cycle the world is stuck in, saying that it's built upon a lie. He's referring to the first sin of Gwyn linking the flame in order to sustain his Age of Light, and that the narrative that shepherds undead into becoming fuel for the fire is mostly fabrication. A lie will remain a lie. He talks of his brother, that he never became a true monarch. To Aldia, a true monarch would be one that rejects the status quo of the world and seeks a new path to break the curse. If you continue down this path of thinking, search the ruins of the DLC areas and claim the crowns of the old kings, then you find a way to truly break the curse. Vendrick can enhance the crowns with the power to halt hollowing, with the only issue being that this only works for one person. With this power though, one can keep their mind indefinitely to seek a new path, a way to truly break the curse of the undead. This seems to be the heart of the themes of Dark Souls 2, to free oneself from the shackles of fate to seek new answers. It feels like a meta-commentary on the nature of sequels and how the developers could feel trapped telling the same story again and again with seemingly no chance to break this cycle. The nature of the world of Dark Souls 2 supports this, I think. The land is characterised by the powers that were left behind, with the 4 great lords you fight seem to echo those from the original game with slight tweaks. Like it's the same story as in games, but with the players altered slightly. It's also mentioned several times in the game that many kingdoms have risen and fallen in the same place Dragonrider stands now, to the point that no one remembers the names of these old kingdoms anymore. This cycle has happened countless times, and this time someone finally said, no more. The last point I want to touch on with Dark Souls 2 is its different approach to representing the process of hollowing. It's shown in the opening, but it's further explored through the character of Lucatiel. When you meet her, she eventually reveals that she too arrived in Dragonrider seeking a way to break the curse. When she reveals her face, it's clear that she's partially hollowed. As the hollowing spreads within Lucatiel, she starts to slowly lose her memories. She talks openly about and cherishes her memories. Not all good memories, but she understands that all these memories are what makes her the person she is. She talks of her brother and the hardship she faced to match him in combat. As you go through the game and encounter her though, she starts to slowly forget things until eventually she barely is hanging on. She entrusts her belongings to you and begs you to remember her as she may not be able to herself much longer. Lucatiel is one of the most beloved characters in Dark Souls 2, and I think it's because we understand what the horror of losing your memories could be, of losing what makes you who you are. Spelling out what the process of hollowing is like to the player opens the possibility to more readily find a way to break the curse, to save people like Lucatiel. The result of the hollowing process is functionally not very different to Dark Souls 1, but I find it interesting to see how much focus it has in the lore and story of Dark Souls 2. It works well as a sequel in that way. And with that, I'll move on to Dark Souls 3. In my opinion, 3 is the bleakest of the series. The basic premise of the game is that the world is at the very tail end of a cycle, where the fire is fading and on its last gasp. The previous Lords of Cinder, those who previously successfully linked the fire, are stirred from their graves, and called to link the fire once more. They all, however, have refused the call. The lands of the previous Lords of Cinder have all converged around the castle of Lothric, the kingdom that houses the most recent person chosen to be a Lord of Cinder, Prince Lothric. But he too has denied the call to link the flame. His armies and kingdom seemingly built to stop others from taking him away. The other lands have converged messily around the walls of Lothric, with the land clearly shifted in a distorted way. Most evident is the bridge that would lead out away from the wall has been twisted off and left behind down a ravine as the land under the castle rose away. This is where you come in. The bells of awakening toll out in Firelink Shrine, rising those known as unkindled. Undead that fail to link the fire. Ash unfit even to be Cinder. They are tasked with bringing the Lords of Cinder to their thrones within the Firelink Shrine to link the fire. And if they don't come willingly, then the only solution is to return with their cinders. Your objective in the game is basically to force those who wish to deny their fate into completing it against their will. Not that these are all good people, mind you. Aldrich, for example, is clearly not a positive addition to the world. Players of the original game will probably be taken aback by the title card upon entering the shrine. It looks considerably more elaborate in Dark Souls 3, plays a more prominent role in the flow of the game as this is the only place to level up now, and has a slightly different air about it. It still fills the role of being the place where wayward souls come and go to find rest, but the purpose of the building feels more intentional, more formal than before. The shrine is purpose-built for the task of linking the fire now, with the thrones the lords are supposed to sit in already set out for them. This hints at how long this ritual has been practiced for, to the point that linking the fire is routine and a formality. Hinting at this also is the uncountable number of corpses of old firekeepers in one of the towers of the shrine, all of which fulfilled their purpose and seemingly discarded. For a lot of the game there seems to be a focus on ash and fire. In the intro we are told that ash seeketh embers, in a similar way that the dark sought light in the original game. In terms of the actual events of the game, Ash, which is the player, is seeking the embers of the Lords of Cinder in order to link the fire or one of the other endings. The use of Ash as a recurring theme is interesting though. Ash is the remains of a burnt-out flame, and is characterised in-game as echoes from the past. People that were left behind in the timeline resurrected to try and seek a new purpose. The NPCs found in Firelink and other Ashen characters all echo previous characters from other games. You have literal manifestations like Andre the Blacksmith, who served an important role for players in Dark Souls 1. The Handmaiden, who resembles one of the old Firekeepers from Dark Souls 2 intro. And Sigurd, who is almost exactly like Siegmeyer from the first game. This isn't even to mention the amount of Dark Souls 1 callbacks in the environment and the enemies too. Dark Wraiths are found in some locations, some areas are literally from the first game or a clear evolution of them, or some characters are continuing the work of major Dark Souls 1 characters. The Big Hat Mages are clearly continuing the work of both Big Hat Logan and Seath the Scaleless. The Watchers of the Abyss are trying to continue the legend of Artorias, albeit not knowing that the legend was not the truth, and so have fallen to the Abyss a lot like their inspiration did. Much like Dark Souls 2 overall, I feel that this use of the Ash motif is a bit of a commentary on the nature of sequels. Ashen ones are remnants from the past, and with them being represented by Ash, it seems to me that this is like reusing a discarded idea to fulfill a role. That the creator of the narrative had no interest in making a sequel in the first place, and so literally resurrected the burnt out remains of their previous flame of inspiration. The world the characters find themselves in, coupled with the endings, also reinforce this point for me. This world, Lothric, feels decidedly post-apocalyptic. The dark soul within humanity has gone feral, manifesting in some hollows as giant black pus dragons that erupt from their bodies. As you near the end of the game, the sun starts being eclipsed and looks an awful lot like the dark sign. And as you approach the kiln of the first flame, the world is truly at its end, with all the lands folding over into each other in a truly apocalyptic fashion. This isn't even to mention that the power of the flame is clearly a lot weaker than in previous games. One powerful lord or monarch isn't enough to link the flame anymore. Instead, the combined power of 5 lords plus the Ashen one is required to link the flame. Even when the flame is linked, there's a melancholic air about it. It always was that way really, bittersweet at best, when you realise the connotations of linking the flame, but Dark Souls 3 makes that abundantly clear. The power of the flames that engulf the player are nowhere near similar to that of the original game, hinting at a much slower and longer burn with a much weaker flame. Linking the fire, you may think back on the choice words that Prince Lothric had to say to you as you faced him.
The fire-linking curse, the legacy of lords, let it all fade into nothing. Rise if you would, for that is our curse. Mark my words, Ashen One. You remain among the accursed.
Perhaps he was onto something. Perhaps there is a way to end this self-perpetuation. Unlike the previous games, the alternate endings definitively end the world of Dark Souls. The flame is snuffed out, or taken within the player to be the Lord of Hollows, and truly bring a new era into the world. The era that Gwyn tried to halt all that unknown time ago. Even the final boss has a definitive end feeling to it. It's a manifestation of all the previous undead who linked the fire, represented by the way it changes the style of its weapon and then using moves that player characters would use. It then ends with it switching to a Gwyn style, with Gwyn's motif being added to the music. It's a fantastic way to end the series really, acknowledging all that came before in this final moment in one intense long battle. So that's most of what I took away from the Dark Souls games. The sequels are interesting when you look at them with the context of the whole series. They both take the fact that they're sequels in their stride and use that to build upon the original in their own unique ways. Dark Souls 2 takes the approach in a more lore-focused direction, observing that the nature of the curse was a topic that wasn't fully explored and utilised that. It used that to great effect and asked the player to search within themselves for answers as much as what was presented to them directly. Dark Souls 3 sought to end the series definitively, positioning itself more as a direct sequel, while still springing off the ideas presented within Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 3 is very much a farewell to the series from its creator, with From Software seemingly having very little interest to go back to the franchise, and focusing more on new original titles. What's great about these games is that there's so much you can sink your teeth into with them. As games, they're good fun, but the amount you can get out of digging into the story and lore is quite impressive. I only really scratched the surface of what these games offer in terms of all that. What I think is quite impressive about both Dark Souls sequels is that neither of them affects the original game in retrospect, and they both can mostly stand on their own because they serve as complements to the original game, rather than purely adding onto the lore or story of it. I don't think either game is better than the original, but they each have very different strengths in comparison to it as well. I hope you've enjoyed this journey with me. Let me know what you thought. I hope to see you in my next video. Thank you.